The note was held down by a coffee mug, and the coffee mug was the first thing Renata Cole noticed, because it was her good one, the heavy cream-colored one with the chip on the handle that she only let herself use on Sundays. He'd used her Sunday mug to leave her. That detail would stay with her longer than the words did. She'd read the note maybe 40 times over the years that followed, and she could never quite remember the exact sentences, but she always remembered the mug, sitting there at 6:40 on a Tuesday morning in a kitchen that smelled like nothing because nobody had made coffee. The note said he was sorry. The note said he'd taken the truck because he needed it for work and she didn't drive it anyway. The note said the rest of the money was in the account, which Renata already suspected was a lie, and which the bank confirmed at 9:15 that same morning when she stood at the counter and watched a young teller try very hard to keep her face neutral while she said the balance out loud. $73. 11 years of marriage, and Dennis Cole had left her $73 and a garage with a hole in the roof. "Would you like a printout?" the teller asked. "No," Renata said, "I'll remember." She didn't cry at the bank. She didn't cry in the car, the old sedan, not the truck, the one with 190,000 miles and a check engine light that had been on so long it felt like a roommate. She drove home the long way, past the elementary school where she'd subbed 2 days a week before Dennis decided her working made things complicated, past the diner where they'd had their first date, and she didn't cry at any of it. She cried in the garage. She'd gone out there to think because the house was full of him, his recliner, his beer fridge, the smell of him still in the towels, and the garage was the one place he'd never bothered with. It had been her grandfather's, technically. The whole house had. Renata had inherited it at 23 and Dennis had moved in at 25, and somewhere in there it had stopped being her house and become their house, and then, this morning, become a house with $73 in it. The garage still had her grandfather's workbench. His pegboard, the outlines of tools drawn in faded marker where tools used to hang before Dennis sold most of them for space. His old radio, dead for years. And up in the corner, where the roof had finally given out 2 winters ago and Dennis had promised 40 times to fix it, a water stain spread across the ceiling like a continent. Renata sat down on her grandfather's stool, and she put her face in her hands, and she finally let it come. She was 43 years old. She had no job, no savings, no truck, a leaking roof, and a husband somewhere on the highway with everything else. What she did not yet know, what she could not possibly have known, sitting on that stool with mascara running into her palms, was that the answer to every single one of those problems was hanging 6 inches above her head. It took her 3 days to find it. Not because it was hidden, because she wasn't looking. For 3 days she did the things you do, called her sister, who said all the wrong things in the right order, called a lawyer, who told her that abandonment was easier to prove than she feared, but that you can't squeeze blood from a man with no assets in his name. Sat at the kitchen table at 1 in the morning, moving the same $73 around a notebook page like the number might multiply if she stared hard enough. On the 3rd day, she went back into the garage to look for her grandfather's old toolbox, thinking she might sell it, and she pulled the cord on the dim overhead bulb, and she finally looked up at the thing she'd been sitting under her whole life. Beams. Her grandfather had been a carpenter, a real one, the kind who built staircases people drove across the county to look at. And when he'd built this garage in the 1960s, he hadn't used ordinary lumber for the ceiling joists. He'd used reclaimed beams, salvaged from a barn that had stood on the property before the house. Dense, dark, old-growth timber, the kind of wood that doesn't exist anymore because the trees it came from don't exist anymore. Hand-hewn. You could still see the adze marks where someone, 150 years ago, had shaped them by hand. Renata knew exactly what they were worth, because of the one part of her life Dennis had found most useless. For 6 years before they married, she'd worked weekends at an architectural salvage yard, Hauling, cataloging, learning. She'd loved it. The smell of old wood, the stories in a banister, the way a dead house could become 100 living rooms. Dennis had called it her junk job. She'd quit when they married because he wanted her home, and she'd told herself it didn't matter, and she'd been lying to herself for 11 years. She stood in the garage and looked up at maybe $4,000 of reclaimed hand-hewn barn beam, holding up a roof Dennis never fixed, and something in her chest that had been frozen for 3 days cracked clean open. Not grief this time, something with an engine in it. She made one phone call that afternoon, to a number she was amazed she still remembered. Heartland Salvage. Is Webb still there? A pause. Webb retired. This is his daughter. Can I wait? The voice sharpened. Renata Voss. Cole now. Well, she almost laughed. Voss again soon, I think. Bex. Beck's Heartline had been 16 the last time Renata saw her, a gangly kid who swept the yard and pretended not to listen to the grown-ups. She was clearly not 16 anymore. Holy, Renata, you vanished. Dad always said you were the best cataloger he ever had, and then you just married some guy and Bex caught herself. Sorry, none of my business. It's okay, it's extremely my business now too. Renata leaned against the workbench. Listen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest even if it's bad news. What's hand-hewn old-growth chestnut going for these days? Barn beam. Real stuff, not the fake distressed garbage. Bex whistled low. Depends. Why, you got a line on some? I'm sitting under it. The silence on the line had a different quality now. Interested. How much? 6 beams, maybe 20 feet each. There's ads marks Bex, original, and Renata squinted up. There's something carved in one of them, up by the wall. I never noticed. Carved how? I can't read it from here. Hang on. She climbed onto the stool, then onto the workbench, and brought her phone flashlight up to the dark wood, and what she found made her go very still. A date, 1874, and initials, and beneath that smaller, almost worn away, a maker's mark, a tiny carved compass rose. Renata knew that mark. Anyone who'd worked salvage in this part of the country knew that mark. Bex, she said slowly, you're not going to believe whose beams these are. The mark belonged to Josiah Farrand. He'd been a barnwright in the 1870s, one of maybe 3 whose hand-built structures were considered, by the small obsessive world of architectural preservation, to be genuinely historic. Farrand barns had been written about, photographed. A few had been disassembled board by board and reassembled in museums. There weren't many left, and the ones that survived were protected. And here were 6 of his beams, holding up Dennis Cole's unfixed garage roof, with the original maker's mark intact and a verifiable date. You cannot sell those for scrap, Bex said when she came out 2 days later and stood in the garage with her head tipped back and her mouth open. Renata, listen to me. You cannot just sell these as lumber. That would be like melting down. She waved her hands. I don't even have the thing. Don't do that. I need money, Bex. I have $73. You have way more than $73 hanging over your head. That's the whole point. Bex turned in a slow circle, taking in the garage, the workbench, the pegboard. Whose tools were these? My grandfather's. He built this place. He was a carpenter. A carpenter who salvaged Farrand beams when the 60s, before anybody knew or cared what they were worth, and built them into a garage. And then his granddaughter happened to work salvage and happened to inherit the place and happened to look up. Bex shook her head. You know what that is? That's not lumber. That's a story. And in my business, the story's worth 10 times the wood. Renata looked at her. What are you saying? I'm saying don't sell me the beams. Bex grinned. Sell me what you know. You've got an eye nobody taught and nobody can fake. Dad spent 30 years trying to find another cataloger who could date a piece by the saw marks alone, and the last one who could do it walked out of our yard to go marry a guy named Dennis. She let that land. How's that working out? Renata laughed, a real one surprised out of her. Low blow. I'm a salvage dealer. We don't have high blows. Bex pulled out a battered checkbook. Here's what I'll do. I'll buy 2 of the beams, the 2 that aren't structural. You keep the 4 holding your roof up. We'll sister in new joists, cost you nothing. I know a guy. 2 beams at story price, not scrap price. That's $11,000 today cash. The number didn't sound real. Renata had to repeat it back. 11. For 2 beams. And Renata, Bex's voice changed, lost its salesman's lilt. That's not the offer that matters. The offer that matters is, come back to work. Not for Dad. Dad's done. For me. I'm trying to build this place into something and I am drowning, and I need someone who can look at a pile of someone's dead grandmother's house and see the 100 living rooms in it. You used to be able to do that better than anyone. That was 20 years ago. Did it leave? Renata looked up at the beams, at the ad's marks, the date, the small carved compass pointing at nothing, and she thought about all the years she'd called this an attic full of junk, because the man she married had taught her to. No, she said. I don't think it did. The $11,000 fixed the roof, with money left over, and the money left over was the most dangerous thing that had happened to Renata in 11 years, because it gave her room to think. She went to work for Bex, 3 days a week at first, cataloging, pricing, learning the parts of the business that had changed while she'd been gone. The internet had changed everything. The salvage world Renata remembered had been local, dusty, word of mouth. Now there were collectors in 3 countries who'd pay absurd sums for the right reclaimed mantelpiece, designers who built entire show homes around a single salvaged door, a whole economy of people hungry for old things in a world drowning in new ones. Bex was good at finding the material. She was terrible at telling its story. She'd post a 150-year-old corbel with a photo taken in bad light and a caption that said antique wood bracket, $40. That's not a wood bracket, Renata said, looking over her shoulder one afternoon. That's off a Quaker meeting house. See the joinery. Nobody's made that cut since 1890, and you photographed it next to a trash can. So fix it. You think you can do better, fix it. Renata fixed it. She rephotographed the corbel in morning light against clean linen. She wrote 3 sentences about Quaker meeting houses and the men who'd built them, and the particular cut that no machine had ever replicated. She priced it at $400. It sold in 90 minutes to a designer in another state, who messaged afterward to ask whether they had anything else, with that kind of provenance, told that way. Bex read the message twice, and then looked at Renata like she was seeing her for the first time. Do that again, she said. Renata did it again, and again. It turned out the thing nobody had ever paid her for, the thing Dennis had called her junk job, was a rare and specific kind of literacy. She could read a building the way other people read a book. She could stand in a house slated for demolition and walk the rooms and tell you which staircase was original and which was added in 1952, which mantel was worth saving and which was particle board pretending, where the good wood was hiding under 80 years of paint. And then, this was the part nobody else could do. She could tell its story in a way that made a stranger 4 states away need to own a piece of it. Within a year she wasn't an employee. She and Bex restructured the whole business, Renata buying in with reinvested commissions, the 2 of them splitting it down the middle. They stopped waiting for salvage to come to them and started going out to find it, buying the contents of doomed houses, sometimes whole houses, before the bulldozers came. That was where Renata found her real gift, and it wasn't the cataloging. It was the houses themselves. This one we don't strip, she told Bex, standing in the muddy yard of a sagging 1890s farmhouse they'd bought for almost nothing because everyone agreed it was a teardown. Everyone says teardown. Everyone's wrong, look at the bones. Renata, the floor's rotted through in the back half. The back half is an addition from the 70s, tear that off. The front, Renata walked up onto the porch, ran her hand along a door frame. The front is hand-built. Original heart pine under that carpet. I'd bet the business on it. People don't want salvage from a house like this. They want the house. She turned around, and there was something lit up in her face that Bex had learned to pay attention to. We don't sell it for parts. We bring it back. And then we sell the whole thing for 10 times what parts would bring. We're a salvage yard. We don't restore houses. We do now. She was wrong about the timeline and right about everything else. The first house nearly broke them. It took 14 months instead of 6, ate every dollar of profit the salvage side threw off, and at the lowest point, month 9, winter, a burst pipe, a contractor who vanished with a deposit. Renata sat on the unfinished heart pine floor of a house that wasn't hers and wondered if Dennis had been right about her all along. That she reached too far. That she didn't know when something was just junk. She called her sister at midnight. He used to say I had champagne taste and a tap water life, Renata said into the phone. What if he was right? What if I should have just sold the beams and kept my head down? Her sister was quiet for a moment. Then, do you remember what you said to me the morning you found the note? When I asked if you were going to be okay. No. You said, I don't know, but I'm done being a passenger in my own life. A pause. You sat in that man's recliner for 11 years and let him drive. You're not sitting now. You're tired. There's a difference, and you of all people know how to tell things apart by looking. Renata didn't answer, but she got up off the floor. The house sold 3 months later for more money than she had ever held in her mind as a real number, to a young family who cried, actually cried, walking through it, the wife trailing her fingers along the restored banister, and saying it felt like the house had been waiting for them. Which, Renata thought, watching from the doorway, it sort of had. 130 years of waiting. She just helped it finish. She and Bex did another house, then 3 at once. They hired a crew, then a bigger crew. The salvage yard became the supply room for a restoration company, and the restoration company became something with a name. Farrand and Voss. Renata had insisted, after the barnwright whose beams started it, and the grandfather whose name she'd taken back. And within 4 years, they were turning the kind of profit that made the bank where a teller had once said $73 out loud send Renata a private banker and a fruit basket. She returned the fruit basket. She kept the account. She was not a sentimental woman about banks. She was a little sentimental about the garage. She never sold the last 4 beams. The roof got properly fixed, the structure reinforced around them, and the garage became her office, her real one, the one she went to when she wanted to think, the others be damned. She put her grandfather's tools back on the pegboard, matched to their faded outlines. She got the old radio working. The carved compass rose, the date, the maker's mark. She had that section of beam lit now, a small brass picture light angled up at it, the way you'd light a painting. People asked sometimes, the journalists who started showing up once Farrand and Voss got written about, whether it was true, the story about the husband and the $73 and the fortune in the ceiling. They always wanted it to be a story about revenge. They always asked, in some polite way, whether she'd ever heard from Dennis, whether he knew. For a long time the answer was no. Then, in the 5th year, it became yes. He came to the yard on a Thursday. She knew it was him before she fully saw him, something in the walk, the particular way he held his shoulders, a body she'd lived beside for 11 years and could still identify from across a gravel lot. He was heavier, grayer. He'd lost the truck she'd heard years ago. He stood near the office trailer turning a ball cap in his hands, and when Renata came out and he saw her, his face did a complicated thing that she watched without helping. Ren, he cleared his throat. You look real good. Place looks good. I read about it. There was an article. I know. I gave the interview. Right, course. He turned the cap. I didn't come to ask for anything. I want to be clear on that up front. I know how it looks, me showing up now that things are. Now that there's something to show up for. He flinched, and to his small credit he didn't argue. Yeah, I guess, yeah. He looked around the yard at the crews, the trucks, the racks of cataloged history, the whole living thing she'd built out of the wreckage he'd left behind. I kept thinking about it, the garage. All those years it was right there, over our heads. And he shook his head. I sold your grandpa's tools for $40, Ren. I sold them for $40, and there was a fortune in the ceiling the whole time. And here was the thing Renata had not expected. After 5 years of imagining this exact conversation, she felt no triumph at all. She'd thought she would. She'd rehearsed the cutting things a person says. But standing there, watching Dennis turn his cap and grasp the dimensions of what he'd walked past every day for 11 years, she mostly felt a kind of distant, weary clarity, like weather seen from inside a warm house. The fortune wasn't in the ceiling, Dennis, she said. He looked up. The beams were maybe $20,000 all 6. Nice money, not a fortune. She slid her hands into her pockets. The fortune was the part of me you spent 11 years telling me was junk. The reading old things thing, the salvage job you made me quit. She tipped her head toward the yard, the trucks, the whole roaring enterprise of it. That's what was over our heads the whole time, not the wood, me. You just couldn't read it. It's okay. Reading things was never your gift. Dennis stood with that for a long moment. The cap stopped turning. I'm sorry, he said finally, and it sounded like it cost him something real, which was more than she'd expected. For the note, for all of it, the mug. I don't know why I used your good mug. I've thought about that. That was a cruel thing, and I don't even know why I did it. I know why, Renata almost smiled. Because it was mine, and you wanted to take everything that was mine when you left, and the mug was the last thing in reach, she shrugged. It's okay. I kept the mug. I use it every Sunday. I think about you for about 4 seconds, and then I drink my coffee. He let out a breath that was half a laugh and half something that hurt. That's about what I deserve. It's exactly what you deserve, Dennis, to the second. She said it without heat, which she could tell landed harder than heat would have. I'm not angry anymore. I want you to understand that, because I think you came here for me to be angry, so you'd have something to push against. I'm not. You did me the biggest favor of my life, and you did it by accident with my Sunday mug, and I will never fully forgive you, and I have completely stopped needing to. Both things, at the same time. He left a few minutes later. There wasn't much else. He didn't ask for money, and she didn't offer any, and they both seemed to understand that this was the kindest version of the conversation available to either of them. Renata watched him walk back across the gravel to a car that wasn't the truck, and then she went into the garage, her office, her grandfather's garage, the place where it had all cracked open, and she climbed up onto the workbench the way she had 5 years before, and she put her hand flat against the old beam, against the adze marks some unnamed person had cut 150 years ago, against the carved compass that pointed at nothing and everything. Bex found her there 20 minutes later. Was that him, in the lot? That was him. You want me to be mad? I can be mad, I'm very flexible. Renata laughed and climbed down. No, I'm good, genuinely. She looked up at the beam one more time, the brass light warm on the old wood. You know what's funny? He thinks the story is that he left me $73 and a broken garage, and I got lucky with what was in the ceiling. Isn't it? No. Renata picked up her grandfather's old hand plane from the pegboard, turned it over, felt the worn place where another hand had gripped it for 40 years. The story is that I spent 11 years letting someone convince me the best part of me was junk. The garage was always full of treasure, Bex. That was never the question. The question was whether I'd ever look up. She set the plane back in its outline on the board, exactly where it belonged. I just needed him to leave the room so I could finally see the ceiling. Outside, the crews were loading a truck with the bones of a house that everyone but Renata had called a teardown. The afternoon light came slantwise through the garage door. catching the dust, catching the date carved in the beam, 1874, and the small worn compass that had been pointing the whole time, for 150 years, at a woman who'd finally stopped being a passenger and learned to read her own life the way she read everything else. By looking, by refusing to call it junk, by understanding at last that the most valuable thing in any wreck is almost never the part everyone's fighting over. It's the part nobody thought to look up and see.